Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started. It's a pleasure to see you all. It's a really good group. My name is Brian Berger, and I'll be moderating the session today for you folks and Tina. Tina Clark is a certified Transition Towns trainer with website at transitiontowns.org, and she's a consultant with 350.org. She has been an advocate, educator, consultant, and director of nonprofit programs since 1985. In Washington, D.C., she directed national citizen training programs for a faith-based coalition and directed Greenpeace USA's Citizen Action Network. Tina has an MA in public policy from the University of Chicago. She lives in an award-winning platinum LEED, a LEED powerhouse. I don't know how many LEDs you have. So thank you very much, and I'll let you know how's timing stuff. You should know your
Okay, all right. Thanks so much, Brian. It's great to be with you all. Let's do a quick go-round, just because it's wonderful to know who's in the room, and often at these meetings, people find new friends. So if you'd like to say your first name and the town and state you're from, we'll just go around. Mindy, would you start?
My name is Mindy. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Did we miss anyone?
Brian Berger, Pennsville.
Brian, what a marvelous job of getting around everyone.
Bill Sharp, Webmaster, Transition Center.
Great.
Mark from Pittsburgh.
Mark from Pittsburgh, wonderful.
We are recording, so this is key.
Great.
And by the way, if there are questions and answers, do you want Q&A all at the end, or do you want it through the...
If you've got a burning inspiration as we go through, feel free to jump up. Is it easier for you at the end?
If you would raise your hand, please, because we are recording live, and it will help to use the microphone.
Okay. Thank you, Brian.
And I will restate the questions to make sure we get them.
Thank you. So I'm Tina Clark, and I'm one of 23 people in the U.S. who've been trained to provide training in how to do a transition initiative. How many of you have heard of Transition Towns before today? Oh, quite a few of you. Fantastic. So this is a movement that's grown global very rapidly. It started in the UK, and there are over 1,000 communities now in the UK that are involved in mulling over or have dived in and are doing a Transition Towns, or what we call Transition Initiative, to help their community become more self-reliant and resilient in the face of what we call the triple challenge, and I'll get into all of that. But it's a rapidly growing movement that is now in Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Hong Kong, Mexico, Brazil, all over Europe. And we had some questions about how well a model from the UK, from Devon, England, would translate into all these different languages and different contexts. But the messages, the concerns run deep everywhere. And every community uses the process in its own way. And then I think that's part of why it has been so wildly popular and successful, is that it provides a methodology for addressing the challenges of our time without a top-down prescriptive solution, but rather a grassroots developed collaborative project that each community takes on. So I am very excited to share with you this model, and I know Pittsburgh is interested in hosting the official 2-day training sometime in the near future, and we're doing, we just did one in Binghamton, we're doing one in Rochester, New York on April 24th, 25th. There's a flyer going around about that, and also my card in case you want to go to the transitionus.org website, and you can see a listing of resources and upcoming trainings. So I'm going to share with you a mixture of slides from the UK, the program that they gave to us when they came over a little over a year ago to share this model, and thrown in with a bunch of slides from my own time in the UK. I've been an organizer and trainer and activist my entire professional, I guess it's called adult life, and I just found the transition model to be the most exciting thing that I'd seen, and so I quit my job with Clean Water Action and have been doing this for the past year, and in the meantime worked with my old friend Bill McKibben on his 350.org, and I've done some work with the Sustainability Institute. Some of you may know Donella Meadows. She wrote a book way back in the 70s, one of the first books to look at the challenge of modern industrial society in terms of our impact on the earth and our ability to survive the way that our technologies are extracting resources from the planet. And she wrote a book called Limits to Growth in the early 70s with MIT and scientists. And her institute's been doing a lot of work on global warming. So some of the slides are from my work with the scientists at the Sustainability Institute describing the climate situation. But many of them, and a lot of the funky ones, are direct from the UK. This movement it's now starting to get well funded in the UK, but they still have their dumpy, crappy little office, their very low budget overhead, and they put all their money into people. And most of the people in this movement are volunteers. The leaders themselves volunteered for 3, 4, and 5 years before they ever got a little bit of income to help them. It's really just a movement that's emerging because it's needed and because it's got a good process. So I'll share that with you and then open it up for questions and conversation. And if local folks wanted to talk a bit more about what resources there are here, we could do that at the end as well. Okay, so this is some of you may have seen the book. This is the Transition Handbook that has been translated into over a dozen languages now. The book was written by Rob Hopkins, who is the founder of this movement. Rob doesn't get on airplanes. He made a decision not to fly. And as a result, this movement, I think, in a very good way, is not overshadowed by one big personality. It's really all about us, and that's what he stresses in his book and in his teaching and work. But he's a permaculture teacher. How many of you are familiar with permaculture? Everybody. Oh, that's fantastic. Most folks. Does anybody want to say what permaculture is? Actually, since maybe I better just do it. Permaculture, briefly, is a design process that communities can use, that individuals can use to try to increase their self-reliance, to work within their ecosystem, to grow more of their own food, and to provide for more of their own needs. And Rob is a permaculture teacher, and back in 2004, he did a project with students in Ireland, and it was the beginning of this kind of work. So you'll see references to all of that as I go through. But this image of how we can shift from a society dependent upon oil to a society that's more resilient at all levels is the center of this work. And the slogan is really from oil dependency to local resilience, unleashing our collective genius to address the triple crisis of peak oil, climate change, and economic instability. So the way they define the problem is that we've lost resilience, we need to regain it, and the way that we address all these challenges is by coming together as a community and unleashing our collective skills, ideas, creativity, our collective genius. There's a lot of research about how human communities and how groups of people can unleash their collective genius. There's a whole body, a discipline of research about the conditions. And so this movement has drawn from that research and from people's experience. There are a lot of corporate consultants and nonprofit trainers and all kinds of people from different walks of life who have come together in this movement. And it's, as I mentioned, it's growing all over the world. This is actually an old slide, but here in the US we've got hundreds of mullers, as they call people who are mulling over how they want to bring transition to their community. This is just a photograph from a few years ago of all the volunteers at the umbrella called Transition Network. So there's the transitiontowns.org website where you get all this free stuff that you can download and read about. And then the Transition Network was created when this model started being spread virally all over the world. And so this is the international network. And these are volunteers in Southwest UK who are participating in growing this and supporting people all over the world. The why of transition, this triple challenge, we talk about it as peak oil, but it's also peak everything, peak arable land, peak water, peak minerals. There are all kinds of resources that we're extracting from the earth at a rapid rate. Another piece is global warming, and the third piece of the triangle that we focus on is the economic instability of our current economic system and the way it interacts with global warming and resource scarcity and depletion. And some of you know James Howard Kunstler's work. He calls it the long emergency, that we're entering a new period, a time of dramatic change when a lot of the things that we've grown accustomed to expect will not be as readily available. So just briefly, looking at the peak oil problem, how many of you are familiar with that? Quite a lot of you as well. Oh, great, this is great. We'll just whiz right through this. So it's not that it's not that people are talking about the end of oil. There'll always be a little bit of oil that people are pulling out. It's the question of when we reach maximum production and what happens to the price of oil after we go over that peak or start sliding down from the plateau. This is from the International Energy Agency, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is a think tank of all the Western European countries, the US, Canada, Japan, all the industrialized countries. And the Energy Agency puts together all the data around energy supplies. They're fairly conservative, but even they finally came out and admitted, this is from 2008, that as you see in the blue, that the conventionally produced oil fields, the current oil fields that we know about and are producing conventional oil are about to be on decline, if not already in decline. So all the great oil fields that we've been pulling out of from Saudi Arabia and Russia, Nigeria, Venezuela, all over the world, are collectively about at the maximum or even on the downside. The light blue area are fields yet to be developed where we've discovered some oil, but nobody's sure exactly how much is there. And notice that even if you take the optimistic scenario, we're really only looking at another decade of supplies at a current level of production. The orange, right above the light blue, is my favorite category, fields yet to be found. But what they mean by that is that the geologic conditions are such that we'd expect to find oil, but whether it's there, how much, is anybody's guess. The darker orange brown on top of that, that's that crude oil, and the green above, the non-conventional. Those are the tar sands and oil shales, the incredibly toxic, polluting sources of fossil fuels that trash the environment, destroy your water supply. You know, let's get all the oil we want and completely ruin our ability to grow food kind of supplies. So that's, those are very shaky things to develop. And then the yellow on top, the natural gas, and some people argue that we're pretty close to a peak in natural gas supplies as well. So this was a kind of a breakthrough graph because the international community had not fully embraced the fact that we're looking at the downside of this peak in oil production. Here's another graph that just illustrates the kind of pace of decline that we might look at in the future. It starts in January 2002 and it ends over here at September 2012. So we're already in this part of the graph, according to a few years ago. But the idea is that we've been at this plateau of oil production, and we've taken a lot of the easy to grab oil out of the ground, and now we're looking at a decline rate which will probably accelerate. Yes?
Is there any plans to update this chart?
Yeah, I'm just showing this for the purpose of the decline. Oh yes, I'm going to show you a more updated version in a moment, but I just wanted to
compare the two.
Yeah, this is not a forecast, but it is a good example of the idea that we might start with a slight decline and then end up with a 4 or 5, or some people talk about an 8% decline. And it's hard to find good graphs, so I just grabbed this one to illustrate that point about accelerating decline. Here's another from theoildrum.com if you're really interested in this topic. There's a lot of information and data at the Oil Drum. And you can see these little gray lines on there. Those are different experts' predictions as of a couple of years ago about when we were going to reach peak. And the yellow is the average sort of range. But a few years ago, they were saying that 2010 might be the year with the recession, the global depression. Some people are saying farther down the road. But whenever it happens, from the historic perspective of the far left of the graph being when Christ was born and up to 4000 AD, we will look back and see the period of oil extraction as more of a blip on the screen. And it really does, as you all know, it's important in all of the current agricultural system, but it's also our major transportation and a lot of commodity products, plastics, pharmaceuticals, et cetera. There's sometimes we try to think about, is there anything that isn't related to oil or natural gas in our lives? Someone came up with one a couple of weeks ago, that if you walk out of your house barefoot with, when no one's looking, in the summer, you might forage some food in your backyard, and you didn't use any oil for any of your clothing or your shoes or the food, access or anything. But it's pretty hard to come up with any aspect of our lives that isn't affected by cheap fossil fuels. Even under the Bush administration, they had a Hirsch commission that produced a report that admitted that the world has never faced a problem like the decline of cheap oil and cheap energy. Without massive mitigation, in other words, action, the problem will be pervasive and will not be temporary. So this is it's a major, huge change that doesn't make it to the nightly news, but everybody who knows about this knows it's happening. I was speaking at a national conference in 1998, back before people were really talking about peak oil very much. And I met a guy who worked for Archer Daniels Midland, big corporate. And his job was he was Latino, and his job was to import cocoa and chocolate. And I said to him, have you heard of peak oil? And he said, oh, yes. I said, oh, so what do you think about it? What does ADM think about it? He said, well, actually, for my part of the business, because it doesn't take as much energy to ship things, cocoa, chocolate, coffee, those things will be delivered fairly readily to coastlines. It's the people who live inland and rely on trucks to bring them stuff that are going to be really in trouble. So I've been doing this little experiment as I go around and meet people from various corporate kinds of roles, asking them if they'd heard of peak oil over the years. And they all have. They all have. It's just like the best kept secret from the average American. The Royal Swedish Academy in October of 2005 put out a report saying that 54 out of the 65 most important sources of oil producing countries had already passed peak, and so numbers have even. Yes?
I was just going to comment. Did you hear about in the stock trading now that it's going to be most required for stock portfolios to include global warming as their risk management for
Yes.
people who are being shareholders?
Yes. Yeah, that's been a big move for a long time. When I was at Greenpeace in 1991, Greenpeace UK had already recruited Lloyd's of London to join them in lobbying the British Parliament, because Lloyd's of London, the big insurance industry, in the UK, had realized that global warming would make them bankrupt. So there's been this buzz in other parts of the world and in Europe that we need to be paying attention to these trends. But it's really exciting that it's finally coming to the US and starting through a lot of activism by shareholders, faith communities, and others in part.
Well, just scary
Yeah.
that people won't believe in global warming, but will think about it in their stock trading, probably won't buy stock in something that's...
Yeah, it's the big gap between those who know and don't talk about it. And yes. Okay. I've just got a few more slides, but basically updating the data from before, that a lot of people are now looking at 2015. Some people think this year, some people think 2012. But regardless of exactly when we reach that peak, or if we already have in 2005, the message is the same. The cost of oil is going to go up. It may not be very far away, and we need to quickly start preparing. In addition, there's a lot of discussion about oil because, one of the saving graces for some people has been the idea of making liquid fuels out of coal. But others argue that we're going to face peak coal within 15 to 20 years as well. So basically, all these fossil fuels are not going to provide the kind of cheap long-term energy that many have predicted. Briefly on climate change, as many of you know, the melting of the ice is really the canary in the coal mine, indicating that we're rapidly changing the Earth's total temperature arrangement. But ice is also important for agriculture. It turns out that we need those ice caps to help regulate the rainfall and the whole system that enables us to grow crops. And as we see increasing signs of global warming, from drought to forest fires to species extinction that we depend upon, there's increasing awareness that we are already in it much more deeply than we thought. This is that classic graph that you saw with Al Gore's film, the hockey puck, or the hockey stick as it's called. It shows 60,000 years before the present, and this last bit that we are at a level of carbon dioxide, CO2 levels, that humans have not experienced in our time in civilization. Here's another close-up of this. This graph shows the purple band here is 1 degree Celsius of variation in temperature, global Earth temperature. That's 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Our entire 10,000 years of human civilization has existed within that 1 degree Celsius temperature range. So the medieval warming and the little ice age that the global warming skeptics used to point to, saying, oh, we had an ice age before, we've had warming before, this isn't anything significant. That all happened within this 1 degree Celsius average global temperature range. Prior to 10,000 years ago, here in Pennsylvania, we had a mile of ice, right? So that mile of ice was equivalent to 4 degrees Celsius colder. Now imagine what 4 degrees warmer, which is what the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in their last report suggested we were potentially looking at, even with some of the mitigation or action strategies. But the point here of the entire history of human agriculture and civilization being within this 1 degree temperature range is really significant for helping people to understand how grave our situation is. We now are realizing that this graph and the results of the IPCC in 2007 are grossly behind because we're beginning to see what they call positive feedbacks. This is one example. Methane bubbles coming up from the ocean floor. There are molecules of methane that are trapped by ice crystals, because of the pressure underneath the ocean and the cold temperatures. They've been frozen in place. And now that we're warming the oceans, we're beginning to release this methane. A couple of years ago, this was just a theory. Now they're measuring that it's happening. There are other positive feedback loops. For example, as ice melts at the polar ice caps, the sun's heat, which bounces off ice but gets absorbed by ocean water, more of that heat is getting absorbed as we melt the ice caps. So as we get warming of the oceans, then we get more ice melting and then more warming of the oceans. There are about 7 major of these positive feedback loops that the scientists are now worried about. As forests dry, there's more fires. More fires release more CO2, which increases the CO2 in the atmosphere, which holds more heat. So there's now this concern that if we don't get back down below 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, and I just showed you that hockey stick graph with 390, we're at 390, and we need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere through organic farming, by building up the soils and sequestering more carbon, by stopping the cutting down of rainforests, and other forests. So the idea of burning wood for electricity, biomass plants, is not something we want to do right now because we need those trees to hold the carbon. We need everything to be holding carbon. We need to grow plants on all of our buildings in all our cities. We need to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and stop burning coal to put it in the atmosphere and the other fossil fuels. And then the Earth will gradually resequester more of that carbon. The scientists are saying we need to get down at least to 350 and possibly to 325 in order to hold all of the Earth's systems. For example, number 2, if we lose the ice sheets and the melted water, especially off of Greenland, increases sea level rise by 30 feet, will flood 196 of the world's largest cities with over 1 million people. Those people will have to move. If we don't stop the loss of alpine water supplies, if we melt all the ice in Asia and China, around the world, 1.3 billion people will lose their agricultural water and their drinking water. 1.3 billion people, it's 1/6 of the world's population, will have to move. The US Army came out in August with a report they did with 2,700 scientists and the top climate organizations in the UN and the World Bank. The US Army joined them in saying that we have to stop global warming, we have to stop this runaway warming, or we face the collapse of civilization. So this is the story that's not making it into the news in this country because of the intense propaganda, the intense misinformation campaign. If anybody's interested in that, you know, Peabody Coal, the coal industry, the utility industry, as well as oil and others, have been active in trying to convince people this is not such a big issue. But the message is we have to get back below 350 parts per million really quickly. And some of you, how many of you were involved in 350.org in the the largest human mobilization in history? 181 countries, 5,200 communities. More people were involved in raising concerns about 350 and the need to get below 350 parts per million than anything else in human history. But in the US, we barely knew about it. Children in India, farmers in villages in Africa know this number, and the average American doesn't because of this misinformation. So this is part of what is mobilizing the whole transition movement globally. We have 10 years. This is the top scientist who blew the whistle on global warming 20 years ago. So he says we're at this critical point where if we keep burning the coal, it's basically, the way to think of it is, and the way I explain it to my family from the Midwest that don't really pay attention to this stuff, is you think about the dinosaurs, it was really hot then. Well, all that dinosaur vegetation all got deposited under sand and sequestered in the ground, and some of it became coal and oil. So we're now digging that stuff up, those fossil fuels from the fossil era, and we're going to get a dinosaur climate if we don't keep it in the ground. So we have to now switch to getting energy from things on top of the ground: wind, sun, water flows, tidal flows, all the other ways that we can get our energy needs met. And that's why we built my house that won first place in this Massachusetts competition. We generated 2.5 times more energy than we needed to run the whole house. It's super insulated, passive solar design, 3 kinds of solar panels, $180,000 to build. It's a 1,200 square foot house. And I made enough energy for all our needs, our backup heating, with this great new technology called an air source heat pump, which we don't use any fossil fuels, we don't burn any trees, and I had 2.5 times more energy than I needed. So we calculated that I could get a little electric vehicle, 2-seater that can hold 14 bags of groceries in the back seat. It looks like a little tiny airplane. They're building it out in California, trying to build it. I could get 10,000 miles a year on the excess electricity from my house. But we have a lot of technologies that we can make this leap, and the question is whether we're going to do it. This is just a graph. New Scientist magazine did a special report looking at all kinds of indicators. So this is, we've got CO2 levels, we've got water depletion. There's a green line here that's forest and rainforest destruction. This is paper consumption. Here's water. Here's automobiles. This is ozone depletion. So there's a whole, and if you're interested, ask me and I'll give you the web link. But it's a good report for sort of showing how we're increasing our consumption of everything and threatening our capacity to sustain ourselves. And now it's starting to infiltrate our economic system as well. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But just to say that we're facing this time in human history where we've got to make some fundamental choices. And if we think about our last 10,000 years of civilization and agriculture before petroleum, the pre-industrial sustainable societies, villages and communities, were able to live within their ecosystems without damaging them too severely. And if they did, if they weren't smart enough to create art and cultural systems to stay within the bounds of that ecosystem, they didn't survive to tell the tale. But as we developed our industrial revolution and our clever opposable thumbs and our creative imagination, our technical skills, it's kind of like, I always think of humans as sort of the monkeys that kind of get into things, or goats. Good analogy, goats, right? We're playful, curious, And we get, all the goat owners are laughing. And we get into stuff. You know, like you don't have to do this huge metaphysical analysis of whether humans are evil or good or all that. That's kind of, you know, passé. If you just look at the new physics and you look at, you know, nature is about experimenting. Nature is about innovation and creativity. So we get ourselves into trouble sometimes. And the question is whether we get ourselves out of trouble. And that's where we're at now. We've had this massive increase in energy and resource use. Population has grown, pollution is up, and we're now at this climax of the wrong kind of climax, right? A climax of extraction rather than, and I think it's a perfect metaphor if you think about it. You know, are we out there gobbling things up, or are we enjoying the here and now in life? And we've got, looking into the future, 4 different scenarios. Techno-fantasy, which you see rampant. It's sort of a religion, right? It's kind of a cult religion that nobody names. Oh yeah, our technologies are going to get us out of this. There's the green tech stability, which I confess I have wandered in that arena a lot in my life, because you want to try to at least get people off the techno-fantasy and give them an idea that they can still have some of their fun. But really, green tech stability, we're not going to be able to build all the wind turbines that, you know, well, actually, wind turbines we could do. We can't do everything that we've wanted to do. And that's where the Earth stewardship model comes in, where it says, look, we're way over what we're drawing into the red on our bank account, and we need to take care of it. Mad Max is the other option. If those of you know the film, it's the hot, dry, oil scarce, water scarce, hideous place that nobody wants to go to. And notice that you get into that horrible future by pursuing techno-fantasy too far. You know, by going over the edge and damaging your resource base so much that you can't pull yourself out easily. So the transition towns is the creative descent approach. It's saying, let's be thoughtful, let's be smart, and let's plan. Because we're going to be transitioning to this lower energy future, at least a lot less fossil fuels. And it's better to ride the wave than get engulfed by it. So this is kind of, you know, the transition folks are saying, let's have a good time. And the rest of us, if we go into that denial phase, are facing collective challenge. Vandana Shiva, one of our heroes, the uncertainty of our times is no reason to be certain about hopelessness, and all of you in this conference is a great example of that hopeful, proactive, positive action on the ground to make a better world. So Rob says, I believe that a lower energy, more localized future in which we move from being consumers to being producer consumers, right? This is what you guys are doing, where food, energy, and other essentials are locally produced, local economies are strengthened, and we learn to live within our means as a step towards something extraordinary. Have you ever noticed that all the great movies have trains in them? You know, all the great movies have people using public transportation because it's about community. All those 19th century adventures where people leave their village and they go off into the great world to have their rite of passage, that's the kind of world most of us want to live in when we're tired at the end of the day. It's the world where there are beautiful countrysides everywhere and where people know each other, where there's a sense of belonging, a sense of community.
Pause for just 1 second.
Sure.
Move this down.
Oh, sure. Oh, sure. So there's 4 recognitions of the transition movement. Life with less energy is unavoidable, and it's better to plan. 2, we've lost the resilience that our grandparents and great-grandparents had. Many of them, like my mother from a farm in southern Indiana, she knew how to kill a chicken, pluck it. I couldn't do that. You know, my life depended on it. I mean, I try. But it's, you know, they had a lot of skills and knowledge. We've got to act for ourselves. We can't wait for government. We can't wait for somebody else to figure this out. This problem is too big. Our institutions are denying it. They're not moving quickly enough. We see what's coming, the storm clouds, and we need to bring the crop in. We need to start preparing for a different world than what we've been used to. And the way to do this is to unleash our collective genius in the community. And in fact, our lives will be more satisfying if we do so. So the way this movement operates is that you go into your community and you ask a question like this one. How are we in this community going to significantly rebuild our resilience as energy costs go up, drastically reduce our carbon emissions, especially here in the US where we have so much waste. I mean, talk about low-hanging fruit and how we can improve our economies so easily, while creating a more positive, fulfilling life together in this community. So you can go around to everyone and ask this question. My libertarian corporate lawyer stepbrother in Arizona gets it. My geologist cousin who doesn't believe global warming happens, she's promoting transition in Arkansas. Everywhere you go, you can talk to people about the economic challenges that we're in and rebuilding resilience and how energy costs are going to make these problems worse. And we can't rely on other people to come rescue us. We as a community need to come together and work on this. So how do they do it? This is the gardening group, one of the 13 gardening groups in Totnes, Devon, southwest England, where this Transition Towns movement began. The guy on the far right is the dentist who let me stay in his house for free when I volunteered. The woman is a retired school teacher. The guy in the rain hat is a tech, high-tech professional. And this is Lou from the transition office who sings to you when you come to the front door. Hello, come on in. They came over, they're in a gardening group, and they are helping each other learn how to grow vegetables. The dentist proudly showed everyone his kale. He'd never grown kale before. They admired it for about 15 minutes in the backyard, and they all came in and spent 4.5 hours drinking tea and having a good time. And I show this slide to give you a feel for the heart and soul of this movement. It's all about relationship building. It's a group of people who've said, let's combine everything we know how to do and invite everybody else to contribute everything they know how to do, and let's have a good time building community with each other. The transition movement now in Totnes is doing what they call transition streets. So 8 or 10 households on the same street are getting together to look at how they can support each other and become more resilient. And the idea is that we're going to face a lot of changes, and it's going to keep changing. Let's build friendships close at home. Let's support each other and see if we can, at a broader scale, come up with a positive vision for our future. So I'm just going to show you a couple of images about the movement as it's unfolding with all these communities in the UK. Like here, there's a massive gardening movement. So every railroad area is filled with all these gardening plots and people who are out there doing gardening activities. In the UK, there's a law that if you want to garden, if you want to have a gardening plot and you don't have land yourself, the town must provide you with space to grow. If they don't have enough gardening, a community garden big enough for all the people who want to garden, they have to buy land so they can provide access to garden growing. Imagine the right to grow food, what that would do in some of our urban areas and in our rural areas as well. There's also, as many of you who've traveled to Europe know, there's a sophisticated transportation system. And everybody in Europe, in Northern Europe and the UK, are switching more and more to bicycles. This is an example of a train station that has bus lines, cabs, pedestrian walkways, and bicycles. And everywhere I went, I saw old people on bicycles. A transition colleague in Holland, in Amsterdam, he said, oh, my 85-year-old mother, she would never think of going any other way than her bicycle or the bus. Like, she would never drive a car. Like, why would you do that? So the idea of a clustered community that protects its farmland, where truck farming can bring in food and provide for the community. This was in Amsterdam, taxi cabs. Lots of parents teaching kids how to bike. And everywhere, all over Northern Europe, there are train stations with bicycle lots. Every train station, bicycle lots where people, and even towns where you can pick up a bike one place and drop it off someplace else. So the whole urban infrastructure and clustering our cities, keeping people tighter in and stopping the sprawl so that we have more room to grow food, just like it was prior to the automobile, before that suburban sprawl. Putting wind turbines everywhere. Nobody seems to object if you put them next to coal plants. And again, reclustering their communities and getting buildings that, all kinds of green stuff growing everywhere, painting the rooftops white to take the place of that ice that's melting. Even in this country, in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg has a proposal to start painting roofs white. What about every generation goes through a rite of passage when you hit 13, 14, one of the ways you get recognized as an adult is that you can repair your own bicycle, you can grow food, and you go through a rite of passage painting the roof. So that every 2 or 3 years we have another flock of teenagers taking milk paint out and painting the tops of every roof we can to reflect the sunlight back to outer space. We can invent ways to do this. We just have to get together and start playing. And that's what the Transition Towns process does. It uses a technique called open space technology, which is not a conference where you go and you have to sit and listen to somebody like me. It's a conference where you go and everybody breaks into working groups, into subject groups that interest them. It's basically what you do here, but even more chaotic in the sense that everyone comes in with all kinds of ideas, and you spend about 30 to 60 minutes at the beginning of the event deciding what you want, what all the topics are. Everybody can volunteer their favorite subject, and then people schedule rooms and times, and if you want to talk about that subject, you show up at that time in that place. And this process has been done with a couple of thousand people. It could work with even bigger if you have the facility size. But what it does is it gets everyone up, moving around. And the idea is, this has been used in corporations and was developed initially in large corporate settings. But the idea is that you go talk about what you're excited about. And you have a responsibility to either be contributing or learning or enjoying. And if you're not actively engaged, it's called the law of 2 feet. You're supposed to get up and go find a group where your passion is engaged. And what happens is that if everybody is given permission to move around and associate according to what they feel passionate about, this tremendous creativity happens. And all these small groups start producing amazing ideas. And all these ideas get written up and shared electronically. And so this movement is utilizing this group process creative intelligence model and some others. That's just one of the big ones. So there are 12 steps in this process. The first is you set up an initiating group, and then you plan its demise. When I first saw this as a community organizer, I said, this is brilliant. This is brilliant. Because what happens, the people who initiate things often become problems. Right? I've been one. You have a great idea, you get hooked on your vision and your plan, and you draw people to it, and then the group starts to go in a different direction. And what often happens at that point is that unconsciously or consciously, ideas get squashed, and new people come in, and their ideas are not welcomed, and the collective genius gets stifled. When you plan the demise of the initiating group, you set up a public framework that the people who start this are not the ones who have all the answers. It's all of us who have the answers. And so that group's job is to go out and invite everybody in the community. I'm speaking in a couple of weeks, the big town near where I live, I'm speaking to the Chamber of Commerce about transition towns. I'm working in New Hampshire where we've got lots of libertarians who don't like any kind of government, don't like any kind of collectivist thing. But they're interested in resilience. They're interested in economic stability. And so we form a group that goes out and invites. In my town, I picked Father Stan, who is the Polish priest that knows every old person in the community. I picked a wonderful woman, UCC minister, United Church of Christ, who is all about the arts and people's creativity. And just loves the idea of community building. I picked the youth social service program director who's passionate about underserved youth and giving them a voice and leadership in the community. And he's bringing in some youth. You go find the people who care about people in your community, not the ones who know about peak oil, not the ones who know everything about climate, the people who really love the history, love the place, know everybody, and you form a group that goes out and invites them all to be a part of a conversation about how we as a community will increase our resilience together. how we can prepare, how we can substitute for all that oil we're importing. For example, in the big city right next to me, Greenfield, the group discovered that they spend $68 million a year. 18,000 people send $68 million outside their community to purchase energy. Now imagine replacing that export of dollars. All the money that gets freed up for everybody to buy local food, you know, to take care of their education and healthcare needs, etc. After you form this initiating group, you do awareness raising because it takes time for everybody to learn about, you know, peak oil. You know, some of them don't particularly care about the climate issue. That's fine. Whether they agree on the climate crisis or not, we all want to increase community economic stability and resilience, and we want to be able to withstand shocks as our economy changes. So you do outreach. The Power of Community is a great film. People have seen it about Cuba and how they dealt with the loss of oil. You then go out and partner with all the existing organizations. Transition is not a new organization. It's a process for bringing all of us together. That's why the initiating group are people who love the community and are committed to facilitating that conversation. So you get all these different organizations, and the more organizations you have, the farther down the road you are. We've had a problem in this country where sometimes sustainability or environmental group leaders have not welcomed transition. In fact, we've seen these amazing kind of criticisms by people who don't even know what the movement is, writing these negative comments. And what's my impression as I've worked around New England is that it's just, sometimes what happens is that people who've been doing this work for decades feel a little bit worried that a new group is going to come in and supplant them or have sort of the bigger, better idea. Transition is not going to supplant them. Transition depends upon them because the transition process is just, it's the conversation. It's bringing everyone who cares about economics and about energy resilience together with those who care about sustainability and the environment. So it's engaging everybody in the community, not just those who care about environmental or green activities. Yes?
Maybe see that backside slide again? Just
Oh.
to see the film.
Oh yes, the end of suburbia. These are actually somewhat old. This is one of the images from the UK. They were describing how they did it in the first 80 towns that joined the process. So you partner with existing groups. I think of this as the ecosystem. You know, that you're rebuilding all the different creatures in the ecosystem to have a complex local entity. And then step 4, you organize a great unleashing where you bring together all sorts of people from the community who have now heard about this, and this is the official launch of your transition movement. Because you don't want to start it and be like a little mini group off on the side of 5 people meeting or 20 people meeting. You want it to be a conversation that's shared by the whole community. So this is the time when you fully, officially launch it, and you get 200 or 300 people. You know, Sandpoint, Idaho did the first unleashing in this country. They have 500 people. They'd been doing the educational work for a year and a half or so, and then they drew everybody together. We do a 2-day weekend training where we talk about all these steps in depth. You would translate all that excitement and enthusiasm, because there's a social psychology that kicks in when people see hundreds of folks in the room. They get excited that something might be possible. And so you translate that into working groups. And the working groups typically cover all these areas. But when I was in the UK, I went to an unleashing in Exmouth. And they had a working group on plastic bags. And at first I thought, that's pretty trivial. I thought, I mean, I wouldn't have said anything negative, but I thought, well, that's kind of strange, isn't it? Just a whole, oh, I was so wrong. I was so wrong. And this really brought home to me this whole idea of not thinking that any of us knows what the right thing is, but fully embracing the creativity and the inventiveness of everybody else we know. Especially people who don't think of themselves as experts, but live very, very diverse kinds of lives in the community. There was a group of 12 women who got educated about oil and started thinking about all the ways that oil is used, and they looked in their personal lives and saw that plastic bags was one place that they use this thing that's dependent on oil. And they decided to start making cloth bags, sewing cloth bags, and they had a Transition Xmas little label that they created. And they started selling these all over town. Well, the bags have become a symbol of community, that I care about community, I care about our future. You as a shop store owner, you give me a discount when I bring my bag in because you care about the community. And what happens is that people start talking at a different level. When they got up and gave their little presentation at the Great Unleashing for Xmas, they had the best 3-minute speech about why getting rid of plastic bags is absolutely critical. Everything from marine life being choked to death. There's that island of floating plastic debris in the Pacific that's about the size of the lower 48, to how burning it increases toxins that are linked with breast, prostate cancer, and infertility. It was just an amazing example of how a bunch of women sitting around sewing had become very articulate and knowledgeable about a practical activity and changed. So these working groups, they're what everybody wants to do. And then you start having all these practical manifestations. In Totnes, they're the capital of walnuts, or they used to be, but a lot of their walnut trees had fallen into disrepair. This is a picture of the mayor wearing the old regalia, and Rob Hopkins and a couple of members of the tree planting working group all planting walnut trees. This really got the older folks in town excited, and it made people see something on the ground. So all these practical manifestations, they now have 65 businesses trading their local currency. They actually had a currency from 917. It was too big to fit in anybody's wallet, so they shrunk it down. And it's become another symbol of local businesses caring about the community and people who use it caring about the local businesses. And so again, it's another way that people build relationships without having to go to an encounter group or become best friends. It's just that old-fashioned style of community where you know each other's faces and you have a connection to that place. In working with businesses, they did oil vulnerability audits to help businesses look at how they may be at risk with oil prices. Some of you may know the Post-Carbon Institute, which is the fiscal sponsor for transition in the US. And the Post-Carbon Institute has something they call post-carbon cities. And it's a wonderful process that a town can do alongside this citizen-based process. Post-carbon cities helps town officials look at all the ways that their community is vulnerable. The city of Portland, Oregon did this analysis, and it was fascinating. It was incredibly eye-opening, and it shifted all of the municipal leaders' perspective about environmental issues because they realized that it was about their own community's economic well-being. Later down the road, you build a bridge to local government, but this is a grassroots voluntary citizen neighbor-to-neighbor project, and government can be helpful, but it's not the game. And so keeping government as a colleague and a collaborator, but not taking over the process is really critical. All these skills workshops start happening, how to can, all the stuff you guys are doing, how to repair bicycles, how to grow your own food, how to rebuild your house, insulate, weatherize. It's all the practical skills that people need. When I first saw this particular step in the process, honor the elders, I thought, that's nice. But in fact, it's really critical. In the UK, their elders remember the Depression and World War II, rationing, and growing your own food, and rationing of oil. And so it's really helped them with their great reskilling to get all these older folks who had the wisdom and knew about the communities, knew how transportation used to work, the old rail line that ran through the city, or how water transport linked in. It's really important, and it's also great for getting young people to understand that another world is not only possible, but it'll have lots of advantages. Because the elders remember all these great stories, all these happy times when people knew their neighbors. And so getting young people interviewing old people has been a big part of the transition movement in the UK. And then this step 11 out of 12, letting it go where it wants to go. Rob Hopkins originally wanted to do what he called an energy descent action plan. And And people were much more interested in the reskilling. Just like this conference, everybody's interested in learning how to do things, the hands-on part. And they didn't want to go to a lot of meetings. So by letting it go where it wanted to go, this huge movement emerged. And they're just now getting around to doing their energy descent action plan. But Rob was smart enough to encourage people to follow their own passion rather than trying to impose a particular solution. So the energy descent action plan, which is kind of a lousy name, but sometimes we call it pathways, but it's the idea of doing a 20-year vision. 20 years is a generation. Everybody who will participate will probably can anticipate they might be around in 20 years, so it's personal, but it's also for your children and grandchildren. It's just the right amount of time for people to look far enough to dream about the bigger changes that we need to make, but not so far that we really don't have a connection. We don't really know what the world will be like. And so you identify practical steps to get towards the vision. There's a whole process that's been worked out. But a big chunk of it is getting people to creatively imagine. There's all this research that's been done on how if humans do not have a dream or a positive vision, they're not as healthy, they don't function as well, their decision making deteriorates, their social skills deteriorate. People need positive. So even as we look at how difficult our situation is, it's this choice to choose to create a positive vision for the future. Because if we don't function as well, and we're less likely to get anywhere positive. And other people don't respond to the negative. Like you probably felt really depressed the first whole part of my presentation. You know, it's like we need to know that stuff. We need to know that we're on the cusp of runaway warming. We need to know that we're on the cusp of rising oil prices. But we need to focus our action and our outreach to the community on the positive visioning. And with that positive visioning, I'm just going to show you an example of how they did it at their annual conference last May in London, where people from all over the UK came together. We did an energy descent action plan process as a game for Saturday night entertainment. And because the idea is not that it's some detailed, specific document, but it's more our collective vision. And so we divided into all those working group areas: land use, renewable energy, water, food, etc. And each group brainstormed a vision and practical steps of where we wanted to be in 20 years. It was just a chance to get people familiar with this whole process of doing positive visioning. And then we put it together in a whole book and ate cake and sang songs and just had fun. It was the most fun conference that I've ever been to, talking about the most horrifying problems, but with so much playfulness. I remember the conference registration form, it said, contact information, are you bringing kids, do you have food allergies, any disabilities, any special needs? Okay, great, so happy you're coming. If you want to ride bikes, we're gathering at 8 a.m. on Saturday. And do you play footy? Do you play soccer? Because we're going to go play. And that was it. That was the conference registration. So it was just this whole free-flowing, creative experience. I'm going to stop here, but basically a big focus now is looking at the indicators of resilience. And just to get you thinking about it, a community could assess, well, out of all the businesses locally, how many of them are owned locally? Or what percentage is worker owned? How many cooperatives do we have? What's the percentage of our energy that's produced locally? What's the amount, where do we get our building materials from? And it's this whole amazing process of thinking about everything local that can be sustained over the long run. So I just wanted to end with a couple of comments about why this model seems to work. This is from folks in the UK. We talk about inner transition as well as outer. We do a whole lot of work on the emotions and the social challenges of making the transition. We choose optimism. We work on a positive vision. We do practical hands-on things that a lot of people are not going to come to educational meetings, but they're going to be involved in hands-on skills workshops. We do it together. In the US, there have been all kinds of programs on how you individually should reduce your carbon footprint. They do the same material, but all of it's at the community level. So, for example, in Massachusetts, we're doing this thing called the low carbon diet. Low carbon? What's carbon? Diet? In transition taught in S, they have the same material They call it transition together. And you do it with your neighbors. And you think about all the tools. I mean, instead of focusing on your household and whether you're doing it right, kind of like a school project and measuring how bad you are, it's like, oh, what tools do you have? What positive ideas do we have for how we can help each other reduce our energy bills? It's a whole different psychology. Not the individual shame-blame game, but the collective, come together, support each other, laugh at ourselves, realize our vulnerabilities, and try to come up with creative ways of doing things. One of my favorite examples of how they did this is they matched the first year that they wanted to increase local food production. They put out a call. Anybody want a garden and you don't have land? Anybody have land that you can't garden or don't want to garden? And they matched them together. All these young people growing food for all these old people. All the relationships that were strengthened. 7% local vegetable production increase in 1 year with no money. Everybody, stronger relationships. That's the kind of approach that this model is all about. When you do your awareness raising, you find your natural supporters. It's all bottom up. You keep the decision making at the lowest level possible so that it's easy for others to replicate. And I just want to end again with pictures from the Exmouth Unleashing, this little town, and tell you this story. This young woman and her brother from Iraq had emigrated with their parents 12 years earlier to the UK. They said that the transition movement was the first place that they felt they belonged. That the welcoming, community-focused, relationship building, it just attracts all kinds of people. And the principle of inclusion, which is one of the 7 principles, we include everyone. And this was a place where they felt that they could be themselves because it's this open environment where you talk about what you're passionate about, not some prescriptive. So I just wanted to leave you with that sense that it's a lot about the relationship building that is helping people heal their communities and create new possibilities. So that's it. Okay.